She was dying in the snow when a stranger's hand reached down and changed everything. Clara Whitmore had traveled 2,000 miles to escape one kind of death, only to face another in the freezing darkness of Montana Territory. The man who caught her before she collapsed didn't ask questions. He didn't make promises. He just steadied her against the wind and said 3 words that would alter the course of her entire life. "You'll marry me." What happened next wasn't a fairy tale. It was survival. It was desperation. And somehow, against a backdrop of blizzards, violence, and impossible choices, it became something neither of them saw coming. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this journey travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop with a sound like something breaking. Clara braced herself against the wooden seat, her gloved hands numb even through the wool. Outside, the wind screamed across the open plains, and snow whipped sideways in sheets so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. "End of the line, miss." The driver's voice was muffled, distant through the walls of the coach. "Can't go no further. Storm's worse than they said." Clara swallowed hard and pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders. She'd known this journey would be brutal. She'd prepared herself for hardship. But nothing, not the warnings from other travelers, not the stories she'd heard in Kansas City, had prepared her for this. She pushed the door open and the cold hit her like a physical blow. It drove the breath from her lungs, stung her eyes, and made her skin burn beneath her clothes. The snow wasn't falling, it was attacking, relentless and merciless. "Where?" Her voice cracked. She tried again. "Where do I go?" The driver pointed toward a cluster of dark shapes barely visible through the storm. "Town's that way. 1/2 mile, maybe less. Follow the ruts in the road. Don't stop walking." "But I gotta turn back before the horses freeze." He was already climbing down, his movements quick and practiced. "You'll make it if you move fast." Clara stepped down onto the frozen ground, and her boots sank into snow up to her ankle. The cold bit through the leather immediately. She clutched her single battered trunk in both arms, everything she owned in the world packed into a box she could barely carry. The stagecoach was already turning, the driver urging the horses forward with sharp commands. Within seconds, the sound of hooves and wheels faded into the howl of the wind. She was alone. Clara forced herself to move. One step, then another. The ruts in the road were just barely visible, 2 shallow depressions already half filled with fresh snow. She followed them, head down, arms aching from the weight of the trunk. The wind tore at her coat. Ice formed on her eyelashes. Her feet went numb, then started to burn, then went numb again. She didn't know how long she walked. Time became meaningless, just the next step, and the rhythm of her own ragged breathing. When her foot caught on something buried in the snow, she went down hard. The trunk flew from her hands and landed somewhere ahead, swallowed by white. Clara tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't cooperate. Her fingers were too stiff. Her legs wouldn't respond. She was so tired. Lying there in the snow, with the cold seeping through her clothes and into her bones, Clara thought about the letter she'd answered 3 weeks ago. A simple advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper. "Widower in Montana Territory seeks wife. Must be of good character and willing to work. Inquire at..." She'd written back the same day, not because she believed in romance or destiny, not because she thought she'd find happiness at the end of a 2,000-mile journey. She'd written because the alternative was worse. Her stepfather had made that clear. Marry his business partner, a man twice her age with wandering hands and a cruel mouth, or be thrown out with nothing. Her mother hadn't even tried to fight him, just looked away and let it happen. So Clara had taken every penny she'd saved from 3 years of teaching, bought a ticket west, and left everything behind. And now she was going to die in the snow before she even saw the town. The thought made her angry, not sad, not afraid, just furious. She'd come too far for this. Clara dug her fingers into the frozen ground and hauled herself forward, inches at a time. She couldn't feel her hands anymore, couldn't feel her feet, but she could still move. She dragged herself through the snow, searching blindly for the trunk, for the road, for anything. Her hand hit something solid. Not the trunk, something bigger. A boot. "Easy." The voice was low, steady, cutting through the wind like it had weight behind it. "I've got you." Hands gripped her arms, strong hands, sure and careful, and lifted her up out of the snow. Clara's legs buckled immediately, but the stranger caught her before she fell again. He shifted his grip, one arm supporting her back, and suddenly she was upright, leaning heavily against someone who smelled like leather and wood smoke. "Can you walk?" Clara tried to answer, but her jaw was shaking too hard. She managed a nod. Liar. There wasn't any humor in the word, just a flat statement of fact. "Hold on." He bent slightly, got his shoulder under her arm, and started moving. Clara stumbled alongside him, her feet dragging through the snow, barely contributing to the effort. Somewhere behind them, she heard the scrape of wood on ice. He must have grabbed her trunk. The buildings materialized slowly out of the white. Rough structures, low and dark, huddled together like animals sheltering from the storm. The man, whoever he was, steered her toward one of them, kicked the door open, and pulled her inside. The sudden absence of wind was almost shocking. Clara's ears rang in the relative quiet. A fire crackled somewhere close, and the air was warm, actually warm, against her frozen skin. "Sit." The stranger guided her toward a chair near the fire. Clara collapsed into it, shaking violently. He disappeared for a moment, then returned with a heavy blanket that he wrapped around her shoulders. "Don't get too close to the flames. Warm up slow, or you'll hurt worse." Clara nodded, teeth chattering. She finally got a look at him. Tall? Broad-shouldered? Maybe 35, though it was hard to tell. His face had the kind of weathered quality that came from years of hard living. Dark hair, gray eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and healed crooked. He moved with economy, no wasted motion, and there was something in the way he carried himself that suggested authority. Or maybe just competence. He set her trunk down near the door, shook the snow off his coat, and hung it on a peg. Underneath, he wore simple clothes, dark trousers, a work shirt, suspenders, and a badge pinned to his chest, a marshal's star. "You're Clara Whitmore." It wasn't a question. "Yes." Her voice came out hoarse and shaky. Are you Caleb Turner?" "I am." They stared at each other for a long moment. Clara had imagined this meeting 100 different ways during the journey west. She'd pictured herself poised and dignified, making a good first impression despite the circumstances. She'd rehearsed polite greetings and careful questions. Instead, she was half frozen, covered in snow, shaking like a leaf, and probably looked like something the wind dragged in and forgot to kill. Caleb pulled a second chair closer to the fire and sat down. "Didn't expect you for another 2 days." "The stage left early. I didn't—" Clara stopped, took a breath, tried to steady herself. "I didn't know about the storm." "Nobody did. Came in fast." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying her with those gray eyes. "You hurt?" "No, just cold." "You're lucky I was watching for the stage. Another 10 minutes out there and you'd be dead." The bluntness should have stung, but Clara was too numb to feel offended. He was right. She knew it. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming to find me." Caleb nodded once, a short dip of his chin. "Storm's not letting up. You'll stay here tonight." Clara looked around the room for the first time. It was small but well kept, a single large space with a fireplace at one end, a simple kitchen area, a table and chairs, and a bed in the far corner. No sign of a separate room, no privacy. Her stomach tightened. "Here?" "It's the marshal's office." Caleb gestured toward a narrow door she hadn't noticed. "There's a cell in the back. Got a cot. You can sleep there." "Oh." Relief loosened the knot in her chest. "All right. You'll want to eat something, warm up from the inside." He stood and moved toward the kitchen without waiting for a response. Within minutes, he had a pot of something hanging over the fire and was slicing bread with quick, efficient movements. Clara watched him, trying to reconcile this silent, practical man with the brief letters they'd exchanged. His writing had been sparse, just facts, no flourishes. "I'm 36. I've been marshal here for 8 years. I own a house and some land. I need a wife who can manage a household and isn't afraid of hard work. If that's you, come to Turner's Bend, Montana Territory." She'd written back with equal brevity. "I'm 24. I've been teaching for 3 years. I'm not afraid of work. I need a place where I can start over." Neither of them had mentioned loneliness. Neither had talked about affection or compatibility. It was a transaction, pure and simple. And yet, sitting here in the firelight, watching this stranger prepare food for her after saving her life, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope. She'd learned better than that. but maybe a fragile kind of possibility. "Why did you come out in the storm?" she asked. "You said you were watching for the stage, but you couldn't have known I'd be on it early." Caleb didn't look up from the pot he was stirring. "I watch for all the stages." "In a blizzard?" "Especially in a blizzard." He finally glanced at her. "People die out here when nobody's paying attention." There was something in the way he said it, flat, matter-of-fact, but with an edge underneath, that made Clara think he was speaking from experience. She wanted to ask, but exhaustion was creeping up on her, heavy and insistent. Caleb ladled stew into a bowl and brought it over, along with the bread. "Eat." The food was simple: venison, potatoes, carrots, thick and hot. Clara ate mechanically at first, then with increasing hunger as warmth returned to her body. Caleb ate standing up, leaning against the wall, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window where snow continued to batter the glass. When she finished, he took the bowl without a word and washed it in a basin. Then he opened the narrow door and gestured for her to follow. The cell was exactly what he'd described: small, bare, with a cot against one wall and a single blanket. But it was clean and it was warm, and after 2 weeks of sleeping on stagecoaches and in crowded boarding houses, it looked like heaven. "I'll be right outside," Caleb said. "Storm should break by morning. We'll talk then." Clara nodded. "Thank you for everything." He paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the firelight. "You came a long way for this." "I did. You sure about it? Marrying a stranger?" Clara met his eyes. "Are you?" A ghost of something, not quite a smile, but close, flickered across his face. "Get some rest, Clara." He closed the door softly behind him, and Clara was alone. She sank down onto the cot, still wrapped in the blanket, and stared at the rough wooden walls. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire crackled. And somewhere between those two sounds, Clara let herself acknowledge the truth. She wasn't sure about anything, but she'd burned every bridge to get here, and there was no going back now. Morning came pale and cold. Clara woke to silence. No wind, no howling, just the muffled quiet of fresh snow. She sat up slowly, every muscle stiff and aching, and pushed the blanket aside. When she opened the door, Caleb was already awake, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. He turned when he heard her. "Storm's passed," he said. "Town snowed in pretty deep, but we can get to the church." Clara's heart gave a strange little lurch. "The church? Unless you've changed your mind." She thought about the letter in her trunk, the careful, spare sentences, the agreement they'd both entered into with their eyes open. "No," she said quietly. "I haven't changed my mind." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "There's coffee. Get yourself ready." An hour later, Clara stood in the tiny church at the end of the town's main street. Snow was piled 3 feet high against the walls outside, but inside, a small stove kept the worst of the cold at bay. The preacher was an old man with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly as he opened his Bible. Caleb had found 2 witnesses, a middle-aged woman who ran the general store and a grizzled miner who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. There were no flowers, no music, no guests. Just 4 people standing in a cold room while the preacher recited words Clara barely heard. "Do you, Caleb Turner, take this woman?" "I do." "And do you, Clara Whitmore?" "I do." The preacher smiled. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." Caleb didn't kiss her. He just extended his hand and Clara shook it, a firm, brief grip that sealed the bargain more effectively than any kiss could have. They signed the register, the witnesses signed, and then it was done. Clara Whitmore was now Clara Turner. Outside, the sun was breaking through the clouds, turning the snow into a field of blinding white. Caleb offered his arm, and Clara took it, letting him guide her down the snowy street toward a house she'd never seen. "People will talk," he said as they walked. "They'll have opinions about this." "I expect they will." "You'll need to be tougher than you look." Clara glanced at him. "I am tougher than I look." That almost smile flickered again. "We'll see." The house was small but solid. Wood frame, tin roof, a narrow porch facing the street. Caleb unlocked the door and stood aside to let her enter first. Inside was sparse but clean. A main room with a fireplace and kitchen, a bedroom off to one side. Everything neat, everything in its place, but nothing soft, nothing personal. It looked like a place where someone existed but didn't live. "I'll bring your trunk in," Caleb said. "Take some time to settle." He left before she could respond, and Clara was alone in her new home. She walked slowly through the rooms, taking inventory. Sturdy furniture, a well-stocked pantry, clean floors. The bedroom had a large bed with a quilt that looked handmade, probably by someone long gone. On the mantel, she found a single photograph in a wooden frame. A woman, young, dark-haired, smiling. Next to her, a much younger version of Caleb, his arm around her shoulders. Clara picked up the frame carefully, studying the image. The woman looked happy. Caleb looked different, lighter somehow, less worn. The front door opened, and Caleb came in carrying her trunk. He set it down in the bedroom, then paused when he saw what she was holding. "That's Elizabeth," he said quietly. "My first wife." Clara set the frame back gently. "What happened to her?" "Fever. 5 years ago." He didn't elaborate, and his tone didn't invite questions. "I'm sorry." Caleb nodded once. "I'll be straight with you, Clara. I'm not looking for what I had before. That's gone. This is different." "I know." "You'll have your own space. I won't—" He stopped, seeming to search for words. "I won't expect things from you that we haven't agreed to." Clara understood what he was trying to say, and something in her chest loosened. "All right. You'll pull your weight. I'll pull mine. We'll figure the rest out as we go." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly warm. But it was honest, and after a lifetime of dealing with people who said one thing and meant another, Clara found that honesty more valuable than poetry. "That sounds fair," she said. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "I've got rounds to make. You'll be all right here?" "Yes." He left, and Clara was alone again. She spent the rest of the day unpacking her trunk, putting her few belongings away, and exploring the house more thoroughly. She found linens in a chest, dishes in the cupboard, firewood stacked neatly by the back door. Everything she needed to run a household. In the late afternoon, she ventured out onto the porch and got her first real look at Turner's Bend. It was smaller than she'd imagined. A single main street lined with rough buildings, general store, saloon, blacksmith, a few others she couldn't identify. Beyond that, scattered houses and the skeletal framework of a mine operation on the hillside. People moved through the snow, bundled against the cold, going about their business. A few glanced her way, then quickly looked away when she met their eyes. She was the marshal's new wife, the stranger who'd appeared out of a blizzard and married him the very next day. Of course they were curious. Clara went back inside and started preparing dinner. She found potatoes, onions, salt pork, enough to make something simple, but filling. By the time Caleb returned, the house smelled like cooking food, and the table was set. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. "You didn't have to." "I know." Clara stirred the pot hanging over the fire. "But I'm not going to sit around doing nothing." Caleb hung up his coat and hat, then washed his hands in the basin. They ate in silence, not uncomfortable exactly, but cautious, like two animals circling each other, trying to figure out if the other one was a threat. After dinner, Clara washed the dishes while Caleb sat by the fire, cleaning his revolver with careful, methodical movements. "I'll be teaching," Clara said suddenly. "If there's a school here." Caleb looked up. "There's a building. Used to be a school. Hasn't had a teacher in over a year." "Why not?" "Last one left, said the town was too rough." Clara dried her hands on a towel. "I've taught in rough places before." "This might be rougher than you're used to." "Then I'll adjust." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Respect maybe, or just recognition that she wasn't going to back down. "I'll take you there tomorrow. You can see what you're working with." That night, Clara lay in the big bed while Caleb made himself a pallet on the floor by the fire. She'd protested. It was his house, his bed, but he'd been immovable. "You need rest," he'd said. "You've been traveling for weeks. Take the bed." Now, staring up at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of him settling in the other room, Clara tried to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she'd been on a stagecoach, terrified and uncertain, but still moving forward. Now she was married to a stranger in a town she'd never seen, in a house that didn't feel like home, in a life that was supposed to be her fresh start. She waited for panic to set in, for regret, for the crushing weight of a terrible mistake. Instead, she just felt tired. And maybe, just maybe, the faintest stirring of something that might eventually become hope. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Caleb rose early, made coffee, and left to make his rounds. Clara explored the town, introduced herself to the few women brave enough to approach her, and took stock of the school building. It was in worse shape than she'd hoped. Broken windows, rotted floorboards, desks that had been used for firewood. But the structure was sound, and there was potential. She mentioned it to Caleb over dinner one night. "I'll need supplies," she said. "Wood to fix the windows, nails, maybe some paint if we can afford it." Caleb looked up from his plate. "We can afford it. And I'll need to let families know I'm starting classes. How many children are here?" "Maybe 20, give or take." "Will they come?" "Some will. Others," he shrugged. "Their parents need them working. Mining families don't have a lot of room for school." Clara nodded slowly. She'd expected as much. "I'll start with whoever shows up." Over the next week, she threw herself into preparing the school. Caleb helped in the evenings, boarding up broken windows and reinforcing the floor. He didn't say much while he worked, but his presence was steady, reliable. Other men from town started showing up too, drawn by curiosity about the marshal's new wife, maybe, or just neighborly obligation. They brought scraps of lumber, old lanterns, a battered stove that someone wasn't using. Slowly, the school began to look like a school again. On a cold Monday morning in late November, Clara stood outside the building and rang the bell, a rusty old thing that Caleb had found in a storage shed. 5 children showed up that first day. Ranging in age from 6 to 12, they filed in silently and sat at the desks Clara had salvaged and repaired. She taught them reading, arithmetic, basic geography. Most of them were behind where they should have been, but they were eager, hungry for knowledge in a way that reminded her why she'd started teaching in the first place. By the end of the week, 2 more children had joined. By the end of the month, she had 12. And Clara began to feel, for the first time since arriving in Turner's Bend, like she might actually belong here. Winter deepened. The temperature dropped until the air itself felt sharp. Snow piled higher. The mine kept running, but work was harder, more dangerous in the cold. Tensions in the town started to rise. Clara noticed it first in small ways, men arguing outside the saloon, wives whispering in the general store. Then it became impossible to ignore. One evening, Caleb came home later than usual, his face set in hard lines. "What happened?" Clara asked. He hung up his coat without answering right away. Then, "Fight at the mine. 2 men got hurt. 1 might not make it." "Over what?" "Pay. Hours. Same things they're always fighting about." Caleb sat down heavily. "Mine owner keeps cutting wages. Men keep getting desperate." Clara had seen the mine owner once, a portly man in expensive clothes who visited town every few weeks and stayed at the only boarding house that had heat. She hadn't liked the way he looked at people, like they were tools, not humans. "What are you going to do?" "My job." Caleb's voice was flat. "Keep the peace. Arrest anyone who breaks the law. Even if they're just trying to survive?" He looked at her then, and his eyes were tired. "Especially then, because if I don't, this whole town falls apart." Clara wanted to argue, but she could see the weight he was carrying, the impossible position he was in, caught between desperate men and an uncaring owner, trying to hold a line that got thinner every day. She made tea instead of arguing, and they sat together by the fire in silence. Over the next weeks, things got worse. More fights, theft from the general store, a fire that was probably arson, though no one could prove it. Caleb worked longer hours. He came home exhausted, ate whatever Clara put in front of him, and fell asleep in the chair by the fire more often than not. And Clara realized, with a strange kind of certainty, that she cared about this man. Not in the way she'd once imagined caring about a husband, not with romance or passion, but with something steadier, something that felt like partnership. She started staying up with him, making sure he ate, listening when he needed to talk. She learned the names of the troublemakers, the families who were struggling, the dynamics that shaped the town. And one night, when he came home with blood on his knuckles from breaking up another fight, she cleaned his hands and said quietly, "You can't do this alone." Caleb looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. "I know," he said finally, "but I don't have a choice." Yes, you do. Clara held his gaze. You just don't want to see it yet. She didn't explain. Not then. But the seed was planted. And in the weeks that followed, as Turner's Bend slid closer to chaos, Clara Turner started forming a plan. The plan came to Clara on a Tuesday morning while she was teaching multiplication tables to a room full of restless children. Through the schoolhouse window, she could see 3 miners standing outside the closed mine entrance, their shoulders hunched against the cold, their faces hard with anger. The mine owner had cut another shift. More men were out of work, and winter wasn't even half over. Young Tommy Fletcher, seated in the front row, kept glancing toward the window where his father stood among the unemployed men. The boy's attention was nowhere near the slate board. Tommy, Clara said gently, can you tell me what 8 times 7 is? The boy blinked, dragged his eyes back to her. I don't know, ma'am. Try. 56? His voice lifted at the end, uncertain. That's right. Clara moved to the next student, but her mind was already elsewhere, pieces clicking together like a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. That evening, she waited until Caleb finished his dinner before she spoke. I need you to listen to something, she said, clearing the dishes from the table. And I need you to hear me out before you say no. Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her with that careful attention he gave to everything. I'm listening. Clara sat down across from him. The mine owner is bleeding this town dry. Every week he cuts wages or reduces hours, and every week more men get desperate. You're arresting people for theft, for fighting, for things they wouldn't be doing if they could feed their families. I know that. Then you know you're treating symptoms, not the disease. Caleb's jaw tightened. What do you want me to do, Clara? I can't make the mine owner pay better wages. I can't force him to hire more men. I enforce the law. That's my job. What if there was another way? She leaned forward. What if instead of arresting hungry men for stealing bread, we gave them work? Real work, paid fairly, that kept them busy and gave them dignity? With what money? The town doesn't have funds for... Not the town. Us. You and me. Clara spoke faster now, the idea taking shape as she explained it. We own land, don't we? That parcel behind the house that backs up to the creek? 40 acres. It's mostly timber. Exactly. Timber that could be harvested, milled, sold, and while we're at it, the school needs a real building, one with insulation and proper windows. Half the houses in town are falling apart. There's work everywhere if someone organizes it. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. You're talking about starting a lumber operation. I'm talking about giving desperate men an option besides crime or starvation. That's not law enforcement, Clara. That's prevention. She held his gaze. You said yourself that if you don't keep the peace, this town falls apart. Well, the peace is already falling apart. You can keep putting bandages on it, or you can fix the wound. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and relentless. Clara waited, her heart pounding. She'd overstepped. She'd pushed too hard, too fast. She was a woman who'd been in this town less than 2 months, married to this man for even less, and she was trying to tell him how to do his job. It won't work, Caleb said finally. Why not? Because the men who are stealing and fighting aren't going to suddenly become loggers because we offer them work. Some of them, maybe, but others... He turned back to face her. They're angry, Clara. They want blood. They want to hurt the mine owner, hurt anyone they think is responsible for their suffering. Giving them jobs won't fix that. Then we start with the ones who aren't angry yet, the ones who are just scared. Clara stood as well. We show them there's another way, and when the angry ones see their neighbors working, earning, surviving, maybe some of them will choose that instead. And if they don't, then you arrest them. But at least you'll know you tried something besides a jail cell. Caleb studied her for a long time, and Clara couldn't read his expression. Then, unexpectedly, that almost smile flickered across his face. You're a lot tougher than you look, he said quietly. I told you I was. He nodded slowly. All right, we'll try it. But I'm making the decisions about who we hire and how we run things. This goes wrong. It's on me. Relief flooded through Clara. Agreed. And Clara? He moved closer. If this works, if we pull this off, you're going to have enemies. The mine owner isn't going to like competition. Neither are the men who profit from keeping others desperate. I can handle enemies. Can you? There was genuine concern in his voice. Because out here, enemies don't just talk behind your back. They burn your house down. They hurt the people you care about. Clara thought about her stepfather back in St. Louis, about the business partner he'd tried to sell her to like livestock, about every man who'd ever looked at her and seen something to be used. I've handled worse, she said. Caleb held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded. Then we start tomorrow. The next morning, Caleb put out word that he was hiring for timber work. By noon, 8 men had shown up at the house, a mix of former miners and drifters. Some Clara recognized from town, others she'd never seen before. They stood in the yard, suspicious and wary, while Caleb laid out the terms. I need timber cut and hauled from my land, he said. Payments 50 cents a day plus meals. Work is dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. You show up drunk or you cause trouble, you're out. Questions? A lean man with a scar across his cheek spoke up. Why now? You've had that land for years. Because now I have a wife who's smarter than I am. Caleb glanced at Clara, who was standing on the porch. She convinced me we needed something besides a jail to keep this town together. A few of the men looked at Clara with new interest. Others kept their expressions carefully neutral. What about the mine? Another man asked. If we work for you, we can't work there. Mine's barely running anyway, Caleb said flatly. You want to wait around hoping the owner changes his mind, that's your choice. But I'm offering real work right now. The men exchanged glances. Finally, the one with the scar nodded. I'm in. One by one, the others agreed. By the end of the day, Caleb had a crew. They started work this following Monday. Clara watched from the kitchen window as the men filed past the house in the pre-dawn darkness, axes and saws over their shoulders, their breath steaming in the frozen air. Caleb went with them, not as the marshal, but as just another worker, and something about seeing him like that, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, swinging an axe alongside men who'd feared him days before, made Clara's chest tighten. She spent the day preparing food, enormous quantities of it, bread, stew, biscuits, anything filling and hot. When the men returned at sunset, exhausted and covered in sawdust, she had everything laid out on makeshift tables in the yard. They ate like starving animals, barely speaking, too tired for conversation. But they came back the next day. And the next. Within a week, word had spread. More men showed up asking for work. Caleb hired selectively, turning away anyone he knew had a violent streak or couldn't be trusted. But the crew grew, 10 men, then 12, then 15, and something shifted in Turner's Bend. Clara noticed it first in the general store. Fewer suspicious glances, more women willing to stop and talk. The storekeeper mentioned, almost casually, that theft had dropped. Folks are buying instead of stealing, he said, weighing out flour for Clara. Don't know what you and the marshal did, but it's working. At school, the children seemed less distracted. Tommy Fletcher smiled more. His father was working for Caleb now, coming home tired, but with money in his pocket and pride in his bearing. But not everyone was pleased. Clara was walking home from school one afternoon when a well-dressed man stepped out of the boarding house directly into her path. She recognized him immediately, Hugh Brennan, the mine owner. Mrs. Turner. His voice was smooth, cultivated, Eastern accent. I've been hoping to make your acquaintance. Clara stopped, keeping a careful distance. Mr. Brennan, I understand congratulations are in order. A new marriage is always cause for celebration. His smile didn't reach his eyes, though I must confess your timing is rather inconvenient. I don't follow. Don't you? Brennan stepped closer. Your husband's little lumber operation has pulled nearly 24 men away from the mine, men I need for winter operations. Those men came to my husband because you weren't paying them enough to survive. Business is business, Mrs. Turner. I can't run a profitable operation if I'm overpaying workers. And they can't feed their families on the wages you were offering. Clara kept her voice level. Seems to me they made a rational choice. Brennan's smile faded. Your husband is the marshal. He's supposed to maintain order, not compete with legitimate businesses. He is maintaining order. That's exactly what he's doing. By undermining the economic foundation of this town, Brennan's tone hardened. The mine is what keeps Turner's Bend alive. Without it, this place would dry up and blow away. I think you'd want to preserve that, being new here and all. There was a threat buried in those words. Clara heard it clearly. The mine kept this town alive when it paid fair wages, she said. Now it's killing people slowly. My husband offered an alternative. If that bothers you, perhaps you should examine your own business practices. Brennan's face flushed. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Turner, both of you. This town needs me far more than it needs some backwoods timber operation run by a lawman with delusions of, is there a problem here? Caleb's voice cut through the air like a blade. Clara hadn't heard him approach. But suddenly, he was there, stepping between her and Brennan, with the kind of casual authority that made men back down without him having to raise his voice. Brennan straightened his coat. Just having a conversation with your wife, Marshall. Looked like more than a conversation. I was merely expressing my concerns about your new business venture. Surely you can understand how it affects my operations. Your operations aren't my concern, Caleb said flatly. My concern is keeping the peace. When your workers were starving, they were stealing and fighting. Now they're working for me, and crime's down. Seems like I'm doing my job. By competing with me directly. I'm not competing with you. I'm running a lumber operation on my own land with my own money. What you do with your mine is your business. Brennan's jaw worked. We'll see how long your operation lasts when winter really sets in. Timber work in deep snow, that's brutal. Your men will come crawling back to me soon enough. Maybe, Caleb said. But that's their choice to make. Brennan looked between Caleb and Clara, his expression cold with calculation. Then he tipped his hat, a mockery of politeness, and walked away. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You all right? Caleb asked quietly. Fine. He was just trying to intimidate me. Did it work? Clara looked up at him. No. That almost smile again. Good. Come on, let's get home. They walked in silence for a while. Then Clara said, He's going to cause trouble, isn't he? Yes. What kind of trouble? Caleb was quiet for a moment. The kind that tests whether this town chooses community or money. We'll find out soon enough which way it falls. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to Caleb's steady breathing from his pallet by the fire, and thought about what they'd started. It had seemed so simple in theory. Give people work, reduce desperation, stabilize the town. But she was beginning to understand that nothing out here was simple. Every action had consequences that rippled outward in ways she couldn't predict. She thought about the children in her school, about the women who were starting to trust her, about the men who showed up every morning to cut timber because Caleb had given them a chance. And she thought about Hugh Brennan's cold eyes and the threat in his voice. She'd told Caleb she could handle enemies. Now she was going to find out if that was true. The trouble started 2 weeks later. Clara was in the schoolhouse helping a student work through a reading assignment when she heard shouting outside. She looked up to see a crowd gathering in the street, miners, townspeople, some of Caleb's lumber crew, all talking over each other in angry voices. She dismissed the children and went outside. What's happening? She asked a woman standing at the edge of the crowd. Someone set fire to the lumber mill, the woman said. Burned half of it before anyone could stop it. Clara's stomach dropped. They'd been stockpiling cut timber in a rough shelter near the creek, planning to build a proper mill in the spring. If that was gone, she pushed through the crowd and found Caleb standing near the blacksmith shop, his face streaked with soot, talking to a group of his workers. The lean man with the scar, his name was Davis, was gesturing angrily. It has to be Brennan. Who else would do it? You don't know that, Caleb said. The hell I don't. He's been threatening us since we started working for you, said we were traitors to the mine. Threats aren't proof. Then what do you call this? Davis waved toward the smoke still visible above the buildings. An accident? Caleb's jaw was tight. I call it arson, and I'll investigate it properly, but we're not going after Brennan without evidence. While you're investigating, we're losing money. That was weeks of work, Marshall. Some of us need those wages. I know. Caleb's voice was strained. I'll make it right, but not by starting a lynch mob. Davis spat into the dirt. You're the law when it's convenient, but when one of your own gets hurt, suddenly you want to play by the rules. That's not how things work out here. It's how they work if I'm Marshall. For a moment, Clara thought Davis might swing at him. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Then the man turned and stalked away, several others following. Caleb stood there watching them go, his shoulders rigid. Clara approached carefully. Is anyone hurt? No, we caught it before it spread to the trees. He dragged a hand across his face, leaving a smear of ash. But we lost about half our stockpile. Set us back at least a month, maybe more. Was it Brennan? Probably. Can't prove it, though. No witnesses? No evidence besides a fire that started in the middle of the night. What are you going to do? Caleb looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked lost. I don't know. If I go after Brennan without proof, I'm no better than the men I arrest. But if I do nothing, I lose every bit of trust I've built with the crew. They'll think I'm protecting him because he's rich, Clara thought quickly. Then don't do nothing. Investigate. Publicly. Make it clear you're taking this seriously. And in the meantime, we rebuild. With what money? I paid the men for work that's now ash. Then we find more money. Clara's mind was already racing ahead. We can sell what timber survived. We can take on other jobs, repair work, construction. And we can ask the town for help. The town barely has enough to survive as it is. The town benefits when crime goes down and people have work. They'll understand that. She touched his arm. We're not giving up because of one fire, Caleb. That's exactly what Brennan wants. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not hope, exactly, but determination. All right, he said quietly. We rebuild. Over the next week, Caleb threw himself into the investigation while Clara organized the rebuild effort. She went door to door, talking to families, explaining what had happened and what they needed. Some turned her away, but others, more than she'd expected, contributed. A few dollars here, some nails there, lumber scraps, labor. The women of the town surprised her most. They showed up at the building site with food, with tools, with their husbands and sons in tow. They worked alongside the men, clearing debris, salvaging what could be saved. Mrs. Patterson, the stern-faced woman who ran the boarding house, handed Clara a hammer and said, My late husband built half this town. Figure I can help rebuild a piece of it. By the end of the week, they'd cleared the site and started reconstruction. It was slower than before. They were more careful now, more watchful. But it was progress. Caleb's investigation turned up nothing concrete. He questioned everyone who might have seen something, examined the burn patterns, talked to Brennan directly. The mine owner was smooth and unconcerned, expressing sympathy for the loss while denying any involvement. You're wasting your time, Marshall, Brennan said when Caleb confronted him. I have no interest in your little lumber operation. If someone burned it, look closer to home. Perhaps one of your workers got careless with a lantern. Caleb didn't believe him. Clara didn't believe him. But without proof, there was nothing to be done. The crew was restless. Several men quit, unwilling to risk more arson or retaliation. But others stayed, grimly determined to finish what they'd started. And slowly, the new shelter took shape. One evening, Clara was working late at the site, helping to tar the roof, when Davis approached her. He'd been distant since the fire, barely speaking to Caleb or anyone else. Mrs. Turner, he said. Got a minute? Clara climbed down from the ladder, wiping tar from her hands. What is it? Davis glanced around, making sure they were alone. I know who set the fire. Clara's heart jumped. Who? Brennan hired a man named Reese, drifter, been in town about a month. He's done this kind of work before. For hire, quiet, hard to trace. Davis's voice was low and urgent. I heard him bragging about it in the saloon last night. Said Brennan paid him $20 to torch the lumber. Did anyone else hear him? A few. But they won't testify, too scared of Brennan. Clara's mind raced. You need to tell Caleb. I am telling you. Davis looked uncomfortable. Look, I know the marshal's trying to do this by the book, but if he arrests Reese, the man will just deny everything. Brennan will get him a lawyer, and it'll go nowhere. Meanwhile, we're still targets. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we handle it ourselves. Brennan wants a fight, we give him one. Run Reese out of town. Make it clear we're not going to sit back and let him burn us out. That's vigilante justice. That's frontier justice. Davis's jaw was set. Your husband's a good man, Mrs. Turner. But sometimes being good isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be hard. Clara understood the temptation. She felt it herself, the desire to strike back, to hurt the people who'd hurt them. But she also understood what Davis didn't, that once you crossed that line, there was no going back. The town would fracture into factions, and everything Caleb had worked for would collapse. Tell Caleb what you know, she said firmly. Give him the information. Let him do his job. And when nothing happens, when Reese walks free and Brennan comes after us again, then we'll deal with it. But we do it the right way. Davis shook his head. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. He walked away, and Clara stood there in the fading light, covered in tar, wondering if she'd just made the right choice or a catastrophically stupid one. That night, she told Caleb everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. If I arrest Reese based on saloon gossip, the case falls apart, he said finally. Davis is right about that. Without witnesses willing to testify, I've got nothing. So what do we do? Caleb stood and paced to the window. We watch, we wait, and we make sure everyone knows we're watching. Sometimes that's enough to keep people in line. And if it's not? He turned to face her. Then we deal with what comes. But we do it legally, Clara. We have to. Because the moment I start acting like a vigilante, I stop being a marshal. And without law out here, all we've got is violence. Clara nodded slowly. She understood. But understanding didn't make the fear go away. The days that followed were tense. Clara felt eyes on her everywhere she went, at school, in the store, walking home in the evenings. Caleb increased his patrols, making his presence known, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. Then, on a Saturday night 3 weeks after the fire, everything came to a head. Clara was home alone, Caleb was making rounds, when she heard breaking glass. She grabbed the rifle Caleb kept by the door and moved to the window. 3 men were in the yard, one holding a torch. She recognized Reese immediately, a wiry man with dead eyes and hands that never stopped moving. Come out, Mrs. Turner, he called. We just want to talk. Clara's hands were steady as she checked the rifle. Caleb had taught her to shoot the week after they married, insisting she know how to defend herself. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised. Get off my property, Reese smiled. That's not very hospitable. We came all this way to have a conversation. You can have it with my husband when he gets back. We'd rather talk to you. One of the other men stepped forward. Word is you're the one pushing the marshal to interfere with Mr. Brennan's business. Thought maybe if you understood how things work around here, you'd back off. I understand perfectly. Brennan doesn't like competition, so he sent you to threaten me. Did I miss anything? Reese's smile faded. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Good. Clara's finger rested on the trigger. Now leave, or I start shooting. You won't shoot us. You're a school teacher. I'm a school teacher with a loaded rifle and a legal right to defend my home. Try me. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Reese laughed, a cold, humorless sound. You got spine, I'll give you that. But spine won't save you if... The sound of a hammer cocking cut him off. Clara glanced to the side and saw Davis stepping out from behind the house, shotgun raised. Then 2 more of Caleb's crew appeared from the shadows, armed and silent. Reese's expression flickered with something that might have been fear. Seems like you're outnumbered, Davis said quietly. And outgunned. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. You're going to tell Brennan that this town isn't for sale. And if you ever set foot on Mrs. Turner's property again, we'll bury you on it. Reese looked between the armed men, calculating odds. Then he spat and turned away, the others following. They disappeared into the darkness, and Clara finally lowered the rifle, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. Thank you, she said to Davis. We've been taking turns watching the house, he said. Ever since I told you about Reese, figured you might need backup. Does Caleb know? Probably figured it out. He's not stupid. Davis shouldered his shotgun. We'll keep watch a while longer, just in case they come back. By the time Caleb returned an hour later, the men had melted back into the shadows. Clara told him what happened, and he listened with growing fury. They threatened you in our own yard, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. And Davis and the crew ran them off. No one got hurt. This time, Caleb paced the room like a caged animal. But Brennan's escalating. First the fire, now this. He's trying to force us out. Then we don't leave. Clara stood. We fight back. Legally, like you said. But we fight. Caleb looked at her, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes. The marshal who wanted to follow the law, and the man who wanted to protect his wife at any cost. All right, he said finally. Then we hit him where it hurts, his money. Over the next week, Caleb and Clara put together a plan. They couldn't prove Brennan had ordered the fire or sent Reese to threaten them, but they could make it expensive for him to keep operating the way he had been. Caleb went to every family in town whose men worked at the mine. He explained what had happened, the fire, the threats, Brennan's attempts to shut down competition, and he made them an offer. "Work for me instead," he said. "Same hours, better pay, and I won't threaten your wives if you ask for fair treatment." It was a gamble. If too few men took the offer, Brennan would weather the loss and come at them harder. But if enough left, within 3 days, half of Brennan's workforce had quit. The mine ground to a near halt. Brennan tried to bring in new workers from other towns, but word had spread. Turner's Bend was in a labor dispute, and men looking for work had other options. Clara watched it unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. They'd hurt Brennan badly, but wounded animals were the most dangerous. The confrontation came on a gray morning in early January. Clara was walking to school when she saw Brennan's carriage pull up in front of the marshal's office. The mine owner climbed out, his face red with rage, and stormed inside. Clara changed direction and followed. She arrived just as Brennan was shouting at Caleb. "Sabotaging my business. You're using your position as marshal to destroy legitimate enterprise." "I'm using my position to enforce the law," Caleb said calmly. "You sent men to threaten my wife. That's assault. You hired someone to commit arson. That's a felony. You can't prove any of that, maybe not in court, but I can prove you've been systematically underpaying workers, violating safety regulations, and operating without proper permits." Caleb pulled a stack of papers from his desk. "I've been doing some research. Turns out the territorial government has very specific requirements for mining operations. Requirements you've been ignoring." Brennan's face went white. "You wouldn't." "I already did. Report's on its way to the territorial marshal. He'll be here to conduct an inspection within the month." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "You can keep operating, Brennan, but you're going to do it legally. Fair wages, safe conditions, and no more arson or intimidation. Or you can pack up and leave. Your choice." Brennan's hands were shaking. "This town needs me. Without the mine—" "The mine isn't the town," Clara said quietly from the doorway. Both men turned to look at her. "The people are the town, and they're going to be fine whether you stay or go." Brennan stared at her with pure hatred. Then he grabbed his hat and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. In the silence that followed, Clara moved to stand beside Caleb's desk. "Think he'll leave?" she asked. "Eventually. Once the inspection confirms what I found, he'll either have to spend a fortune bringing the mine up to code or shut it down. Either way, his profit margin disappears." Caleb looked up at her. "But he'll make trouble before he goes. We need to be ready." Clara nodded. "Then we'll be ready." That night, lying in bed, Clara thought about how much had changed in just a few months. She'd arrived in Turner's Bend expecting nothing more than survival. A roof over her head, food on the table, a life that was at least better than the one she'd escaped. Instead, she'd found purpose, a community worth fighting for, and a partner who trusted her enough to fight alongside him. She'd also found enemies, real ones, the kind who meant real harm. But as she listened to Caleb's breathing from across the room and thought about the people who'd rallied to help rebuild the lumber operation, she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that was worth more than any promise of safety. Brennan didn't leave quietly. For 3 weeks after Caleb's threat, the mine owner stayed in Turner's Bend like a storm cloud that wouldn't move on. He walked the streets with a kind of coiled tension, watching everything, saying little. His men, the few who'd remained loyal, watched too, their eyes hard and calculating. Clara felt the shift in the town's atmosphere. Conversations stopped when she entered the general store. Women she'd thought were becoming friends suddenly had errands to run when she approached. Even some of the children at school seemed nervous, glancing toward the windows as if expecting something bad to happen. "They're scared," Caleb said one evening. He was cleaning his revolver at the kitchen table, the mechanical movements of his hands betraying nothing of whatever he was feeling. "Brennan's making sure everyone knows he's still here, still powerful. People remember that the mine was here before we were, and they're worried about picking the wrong side." Clara was mending one of Caleb's shirts, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with sharp, angry jabs. "The mine is finished. You said so yourself. Once the inspection happens—" "The inspection hasn't happened yet," Caleb set down the gun and looked at her. And until it does, Brennan still has leverage. Money, connections, the ability to make life difficult for anyone who crosses him. So we just wait? We wait. We stay alert. And we don't give him any excuse to claim we're the aggressors. But waiting felt like swallowing glass. Every day that passed without incident only wound Clara's nerves tighter. She kept the rifle close when she was home alone. She varied her route to and from school. She noticed which buildings had good sightlines to the street and which alleys were too dark to walk past safely. Caleb noticed too. One night he found her standing at the window, staring out at the empty street, and came up behind her. "You can't live like this," he said quietly. "Like what?" "Like you're waiting to be attacked." His hand rested on her shoulder, warm and solid. "That's what he wants. To make you afraid. Don't give him that." Clara turned to face him. "I'm not afraid of Brennan." "Yes, you are, and that's smart. Fear keeps you careful, but don't let it paralyze you." She wanted to argue, but he was right. She'd spent so much energy watching for threats that she'd stopped living, stopped enjoying the small victories they'd won. The lumber operation was running smoothly. Crime in Turner's Bend was at its lowest point in years. Her school had grown to 18 students, and some of them were actually learning. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Stay calm when everything's falling apart?" Caleb's expression shifted, something painful crossing his features before he locked it away. "I don't. I just hide it better." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. Clara reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm, and something passed between them. Not desire exactly, but recognition. An acknowledgement that they were both carrying more weight than they showed. "We're going to get through this," she said. "I know." But his voice held a note of uncertainty that made Clara's chest tighten. The blow came from an unexpected direction. Clara was teaching arithmetic on a Thursday afternoon when Mrs. Patterson appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, her face drawn and worried. "Mrs. Turner, I need to speak with you. Now." Clara dismissed the children early and followed Mrs. Patterson outside. The older woman waited until they were alone before speaking. "Brennan's been talking to parents," she said without preamble, "telling them the school isn't safe, that you and the marshal have made Turner's Bend a target for violence, and their children shouldn't be anywhere near you." Clara's stomach dropped. "That's insane. We've made the town safer, not more dangerous." "I know that. You know that. But Brennan's convincing. He's offering to pay for a new teacher if the parents withdraw their children from your school." "Can he do that?" "He can do whatever he wants if people believe him." Mrs. Patterson's voice was tight with frustration. "I've already heard talk. Some families are considering pulling their children out." Clara looked back at the schoolhouse, the building she'd helped repair with her own hands, the desks she'd salvaged and fixed, the slates she'd bought with money she and Caleb could barely spare. The thought of it sitting empty because Brennan had poisoned people's minds made her furious. "Let them pull their children," she said coldly. "I'll teach whoever stays." "Clara, I won't beg people to trust me. Either they see what we're trying to do here, or they don't." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're tougher than I gave you credit for, but tough won't keep children in desks if their parents are too frightened to send them." That night, Clara told Caleb what had happened. He listened in silence, his jaw working, and when she finished, he stood and grabbed his coat. "Where are you going?" "To have a conversation with Brennan." Clara caught his arm. "That's what he wants. He's baiting you. If you confront him now, he'll claim you're harassing him, and he'll use it against us. I'm not going to let him destroy everything you've built. He can't destroy it unless I let him." Clara moved to stand in front of him, blocking the door. "We do this smart, Caleb. Not angry." "Then how?" Clara thought quickly. "We fight him the same way we've fought everything else. We show people the truth. We invite parents to come see the school, see what their children are learning. We make Brennan's lies so obvious that even the people who want to believe him can't." Caleb's expression was skeptical. "You think that'll work?" "I think it's better than giving Brennan exactly what he wants." He was quiet for a long moment, then slowly removed his coat. "All right, we try it your way." The next day, Clara sent notes home with every student, inviting their parents to visit the school on Friday afternoon. She spent the evening preparing, cleaning the schoolhouse until it gleamed, arranging the students' work on the walls, planning a demonstration that would show exactly how much progress the children had made. Friday came cold and bright. Clara arrived at school early, nerves buzzing under her skin. The children trickled in, quieter than usual, sensing that something important was happening. By 2 o'clock, parents began to arrive. Not as many as Clara had hoped, maybe half the families sent someone, but enough. They filed into the small building and stood along the walls, watching with wary curiosity. Clara didn't waste time with speeches. She simply started teaching. She called on Tommy Fletcher first. "Tommy, can you read the passage on the board?" The boy stood, cleared his throat, and read clearly and confidently. His father, standing against the back wall, straightened with visible pride. "Sarah, show us your arithmetic." Sarah worked through a multiplication problem on the slate board, explaining each step. Her mother watched with wide eyes. The girl had barely known her numbers when she'd started. One by one, Clara demonstrated what her students had learned: reading, writing, mathematics, geography. The children rose to the occasion, eager to show what they could do. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then Tommy's father started clapping. Slowly, others joined in. Clara faced the parents. "Mr. Brennan has told you that this school isn't safe, that your children are in danger because my husband and I have angered him. What he's really saying is that he wants to punish you for not doing what he wants. He wants to take away the education your children are finally receiving because it reminds him that he doesn't control everything in this town." "That's not fair," a woman said. "Mr. Brennan built the mine. He gave us all jobs." "The mine was already here," Clara said. "Brennan just bought it. And instead of investing in this community, he's been bleeding it dry. You all know it's true. You've watched your wages drop while he gets richer. You've buried men who died in cave-ins that could have been prevented if he'd spent money on safety instead of his own pockets." "Easy for you to say," another man challenged. "You don't need the mine. Your husband's got his lumber operation." "My husband started that operation because men were starving while Brennan counted his profits. And now Brennan wants to destroy it in this school because he can't stand the idea of people having options." The room erupted in argument. Some parents defended Brennan. Others defended Clara. Voices rose, accusations flew, and for a moment Clara thought she'd made everything worse. Then a quiet voice cut through the noise. "My son couldn't read his own name 4 months ago." It was Tommy's father, his weathered face serious. "Now he's reading books. Real books. Whatever else is happening in this town, whatever fight is going on between the marshal and Brennan, that's real. That matters." Another parent spoke up. "My daughter knows her multiplication tables better than I do. That's worth something." Slowly, the tide turned. Not everyone was convinced. Several parents left looking troubled and uncertain, but more stayed. When the meeting ended, Clara had commitments from most families that their children would continue attending. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. That evening, Caleb came home to find Clara sitting at the table, exhausted but satisfied. "How'd it go?" he asked. "We kept most of them, lost a few, but most stayed." Caleb sat down across from her. "Brennan's not going to stop. You know that." "I know, but neither are we." He reached across the table and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. They sat like that for a while, not speaking, just holding on to each other in the gathering darkness. The territorial marshal arrived 2 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon. Clara was sweeping the porch when she saw the official carriage roll into town, drawn by 4 horses and flying the territorial flag. A tall man in a clean uniform stepped out, surveyed the town with sharp eyes, and headed straight for Caleb's office. Clara abandoned the broom and followed at a distance. She found a position across the street where she could watch without being obvious. The inspection took 3 days. The territorial marshal, his name was William Cross, examined every inch of the mine, reviewed Brennan's records, and interviewed workers. He was thorough and impassive, giving nothing away. Brennan followed him everywhere, arguing, explaining, making excuses. Clara watched the mine owner's confidence slowly crack as Cross methodically documented violation after violation. On the 3rd day, Cross emerged from the mine and had a long conversation with Caleb in the marshal's office. Clara waited outside, practically vibrating with tension, until Caleb finally came out. "Well?" she demanded. "The mine's being shut down pending major renovations. Brennan has 30 days to bring it up to code or sell it to someone who will." Caleb's face was carefully neutral, but there was satisfaction in his eyes. Cross found over 40 safety violations, evidence of wage theft, and improper permits. Said it's one of the worst operations he's ever inspected. Clara wanted to cheer. Instead, she just nodded. What about Brennan? He's not being charged. Cross said there's not quite enough evidence for criminal prosecution, but his reputation's destroyed. No one's going to do business with him after this. So he'll leave? Eventually. But wounded animals bite, Clara. Watch yourself. Caleb's warning proved prophetic. That night, someone threw a rock through their window. The next day, Clara found threatening notes in her schoolhouse. On Friday, one of Caleb's workers was attacked walking home from the timber site, beaten badly enough to need a doctor. Caleb arrested 2 of Brennan's remaining men for the assault, but he knew there were others. The mine owner was lashing out, trying to inflict as much damage as possible before he left. This has to end, Clara said one evening. She was helping Caleb board up their broken window, her hand steady despite the anger coursing through her. He's going to get someone killed. I know, I'm working on it. Work faster. Caleb paused, hammer in hand, and looked at her. You want me to do what exactly? Arrest him for crimes I can't prove, run him out of town at gunpoint? If that's what it takes, that's not who I am. His voice was firm. And it's not who you want me to be. Clara wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The moment they abandoned the law, they became no different than Brennan. And yet watching him hurt people while they did nothing felt like swallowing poison. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Davis appeared at their door on a Sunday morning, his expression grim. There's something you need to see, he said. He led them to the edge of town, where a group of workers had gathered near the old mine entrance. As Clara and Caleb approached, the crowd parted to reveal what they'd found. Brennan's carriage, abandoned and half-hidden behind a collapsed shed. Inside were documents, ledgers, correspondence, contracts. Evidence of everything Brennan had been doing. Bribes to officials. Payments to Reese for the arson. Orders to intimidate workers. All of it documented in Brennan's own handwriting. Where did this come from? Caleb asked, already reaching for the papers. Someone left it here overnight, Davis said. No note, no explanation, just the carriage and the documents. Clara looked at the gathered workers, studying their faces. Most looked genuinely surprised, but a few, including Davis, had expressions that were just a little too carefully neutral. Someone had stolen these documents and left them here deliberately. Someone who wanted Brennan gone, but didn't want credit for making it happen. Caleb gathered the documents carefully. This is evidence of multiple crimes. I'll need to send this to the territorial marshal. What about Brennan? Someone asked. You going to arrest him? If he's still in town when I go looking for him. Caleb's voice was flat. But somehow, I don't think he will be. He was right. By the time they returned to the main street, Brennan's boarding house room had been cleared out. The mine owner had vanished, leaving behind unpaid debts and angry creditors. Clara stood in the empty room, looking at the bare mattress and abandoned furniture, and felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that he was gone, frustration that he'd escaped justice, and a nagging suspicion that they hadn't seen the last of him. He'll be back, she said quietly. Caleb stood beside her. Maybe, but not for a while. And by then, we'll be ready. With Brennan gone, Turner's Bend began to breathe again. The tension that had gripped the town for months slowly eased. Families came back to Clara's school. The lumber operation expanded, hiring more workers and taking on bigger contracts. The general store started turning a profit again. Spring arrived in fits and starts, cold days followed by warm ones, snow melting into mud, the first green shoots pushing up through thawed ground. Clara stood in the schoolyard one afternoon, watching her students play during recess, and realized she was happy. Actually happy. Not just surviving or managing or enduring, but genuinely content with the life she'd built. Caleb noticed the change in her. They'd grown closer over the winter months. Not romantically, exactly, but with a deepening partnership that felt more solid than any marriage built on passion alone. They talked more, shared meals in comfortable silence, made decisions together about the lumber business and the household. One evening in late March, Clara was preparing dinner when Caleb came home earlier than usual. He stood in the doorway, watching her work, and there was something different in his expression. What? She asked. I was thinking about the bedroom. Clara's hand stilled. They'd maintained the same arrangement since their wedding, her in the bed, him on a pallet by the fire. It had worked, but Clara had noticed lately how often Caleb woke with a stiff back, how he moved more carefully in the mornings. "What about it?" she asked carefully. "It's a big bed, plenty of room for 2 people. He wasn't looking at her, focusing instead on removing his boots. "If you'd be comfortable with that." Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. "I'd be comfortable with that." Caleb nodded once, still not meeting her eyes. "All right then." That night, for the first time, they shared the bed. They kept to their own sides, careful not to touch, but Clara was intensely aware of him beside her. The sound of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body, the way he turned once in the night and his hand brushed her arm before he pulled it back. She didn't sleep much, but when morning came and she woke to find him still there, watching the dawn light through the window, she felt something settle inside her. This was her life now, this man, this town, this strange partnership that had somehow become real, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. Over the next weeks, small things changed. Caleb started touching her more. Casual contact, his hand on her back as they walked, his shoulder brushing hers at the dinner table. Clara found herself leaning into those touches, seeking them out. They didn't talk about it. Words would have made it awkward, forced them to define something that was better left undefined. Instead, they just let it happen. One warm evening in April, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Caleb spoke. "I wasn't sure this would work," he said quietly. "When I put that advertisement in the paper, I was just trying to fill a gap. Someone to manage the house, help with daily living. I didn't expect—" He stopped, struggling for words. "I know," Clara said. "Do you?" She looked at him. "I married you because I needed to escape. You married me because you needed help. We both went into this for practical reasons, but somewhere along the way it became something else." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "I'm glad you answered that advertisement." "So am I." They sat like that until darkness fell, hands linked, watching the first stars appear. That night when they went to bed, Caleb didn't stay on his side. He moved closer, tentative, giving Clara every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she turned into his arms, and for the first time since Elizabeth's photograph had been put away in a drawer weeks ago, Caleb held someone. Clara felt his heart beating against her back, felt the careful way he curved around her, and understood that they'd crossed another threshold. This marriage, born of desperation and necessity, had become something real. She fell asleep feeling safer than she had in years. The next morning brought news that shattered that safety. Clara was at school when Davis came running, his face pale. "Mrs. Turner, you need to come quick. There's been an accident at the timber site." Clara's blood turned to ice. "What happened?" "Tree fell wrong. Crushed one of the men. We need the marshal, but we need you too." "The man who's hurt." "It's bad." Clara ran. She found Caleb already at the site, kneeling beside a figure on the ground. A massive pine trunk lay nearby, and there was too much blood soaking into the sawdust. The injured man was young, barely 20, one of the newer workers. His leg was twisted at an impossible angle, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. "We need to move him to town," Caleb said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "But carefully. Any ideas?" Clara's mind raced. She'd seen injuries before, back when she taught in a rough neighborhood in St. Louis. Never anything this severe, but she knew the basics. "We need a flatboard, something to keep his spine stable, and we need to stop the bleeding before we move him." She started tearing strips from her skirt. "Someone get the doctor. Now!" The next hour was a blur. Clara worked alongside Caleb, following his steady commands, doing what needed to be done. The young man, his name was Peter, screamed when they moved him, then mercifully passed out. They got him to town and into the doctor's office. The physician, an older man who'd seen his share of frontier injuries, examined Peter and gave them a grim assessment. "He'll live, but that leg's ruined. Best I can do is set it and hope it heals straight enough for him to walk with a crutch." Clara felt sick. Peter had a wife and a baby daughter. How would they survive if he couldn't work? She stepped outside into the cool air, trying to steady herself. Caleb followed. "You did good in there," he said. "I didn't do anything. You kept your head. That's something." He leaned against the wall beside her. "This is the part people don't talk about. Everyone celebrates when you start a business, hire workers, build something. Nobody mentions what happens when it all goes wrong. It wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? I hired him. I sent him to cut timber. I'm responsible. Clara turned to face him. Accidents happen, Caleb. You can't control everything. I should have been more careful. Should have insisted on better training, better safety measures. Stop. Clara grabbed his arm. You're doing everything you can. Sometimes that's not enough, and that's not your fault. Caleb looked at her, and she saw the guilt and fear in his eyes. He was thinking about Elizabeth, she realized, about loss and failure, and all the ways he'd been unable to protect the people he cared about. I can't lose anyone else, he said quietly. You won't. Clara moved closer. We're going to take care of Peter and his family. We're going to make sure the site is safer, and we're going to keep building what we started, together. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her tight, and Clara realized that at some point in the past months, they'd stopped being two people sharing a house and become partners in every sense of the word. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, and that would have to be enough. Peter's recovery was slow and painful. Clara visited him and his wife Sarah every few days, bringing food and whatever help she could offer. The young woman held her baby daughter close and tried to hide her fear, but Clara saw it anyway, the terror of not knowing how they'd survive if Peter couldn't work again. We'll figure something out, Clara told her on one of those visits. Your husband isn't going to lose his job. Sarah looked up with red-rimmed eyes. How can he work with a ruined leg? He can barely stand. Then we'll find him work he can do sitting down. Clara spoke with more confidence than she felt. Bookkeeping, maybe, or managing supplies. Caleb needs someone to handle that anyway. It wasn't charity. Caleb really did need help with the business side of the lumber operation. But Clara made sure Sarah understood it was a real job, with real wages, not a handout. When she told Caleb about the offer that night, he was quiet for a moment. You think Peter can handle it? He asked. I think Peter needs to feel useful, and I think you need someone tracking inventory and expenses before this whole operation gets too big to manage. Clara set plates on the table. It solves two problems. Caleb nodded slowly. All right. When he's healed enough, we'll start him on the books. That conversation marked a shift in how they ran things. Clara had always helped with decisions, but now she was actively shaping the direction of the lumber business. She had ideas, lots of them, and Caleb listened. They started training workers in basic first aid. Clara organized it, pulling information from books the doctor lent her, and teaching the crew what to do when someone got hurt. It wasn't much, but it meant the difference between panic and action when accidents happened. They also established safety protocols. Mandatory rest breaks. Rules about how close men could work to falling timber. A buddy system so no one worked alone in dangerous situations. Some of the workers grumbled about the new rules. Davis was the most vocal. We're grown men, Marshall. We don't need a nursemaid telling us when to take breaks. You need to stay alive long enough to collect your wages, Caleb said flatly. The rules stay. But the grumbling faded after another accident was prevented when a worker's partner spotted a widowmaker branch about to fall and pulled him clear. The man would have died without the buddy system. After that, nobody complained about the safety rules. Spring deepened into summer. The school year ended, though Clara kept teaching a handful of students who wanted to continue learning through the warm months. The lumber operation expanded again, taking on contracts to supply wood for construction projects in 3 neighboring towns. Money started coming in steadily. Real money, enough that Clara and Caleb could begin thinking beyond just survival. One evening in June, Caleb came home and found Clara sitting at the table with papers spread everywhere, sketches, calculations, notes in her careful handwriting. What's all this? He asked. Clara looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. I've been thinking about the old mine. Caleb's expression immediately became wary. What about it? It's sitting empty. Brennan's gone, the equipment's still there, and the territorial government is looking for someone to buy it and reopen it properly. She pushed one of the papers toward him. What if we did? We're lumber people, Clara. We don't know anything about mining. We didn't know anything about lumber either when we started. We learned. She stood and moved to stand beside him, pointing to her notes. Look, the mine has value. There's still copper in those hills, but it needs to be run right. Fair wages, safe conditions, proper maintenance, everything Brennan refused to do. That takes money we don't have. We could get investors or a loan from the territorial bank. Clara was talking faster now, caught up in the vision. Think about it, Caleb. If we own both the lumber operation and the mine, we control the two biggest sources of employment in Turner's Bend. We could reshape this whole town, make it a place where people can actually build lives instead of just scraping by. Caleb studied the papers, his expression unreadable. This is a big risk. Everything we've done has been a risk. This is different. Mining is dangerous even when it's done right. Men die underground. And if we take on debt to finance this and it fails, we lose everything. Clara sat down beside him. I know, but I also know that if someone doesn't buy that mine and run it properly, someone like Brennan will come back. And all the progress we've made, the community we've built, it'll fall apart again. Caleb was quiet for a long time, staring at Clara's sketches. Then he said, I'll need to talk to some people, get a real assessment of what the mine would cost to reopen. But Clara, if we do this, it can't be halfway. We'd have to commit completely. I know. He looked at her then, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. You sure you want to tie yourself to this town permanently? You could still leave. Go back east, start over somewhere easier. The question surprised her. Is that what you think I want? I think you came here desperate and agreed to marry a stranger because you didn't have other options. Now you do. The school's successful. You've got teaching experience. You could get a position in a real city with a real salary. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. Caleb, I'm not staying in Turner's Bend because I don't have other options. I'm staying because this is where I want to be. Why? It was a fair question. She thought about how to answer it honestly. Because for the first time in my life, I'm building something that matters, she said finally. Not just surviving or getting by, but actually making a difference. These children I teach, they're learning things that will change their lives. The families who depend on our lumber operation, they're stable now, secure. And you... She stopped, suddenly self-conscious. Me what? You're the first person who's ever treated me like a partner. Not property, not an obligation, but an equal. She met his eyes. I don't want to leave that. Caleb's grip on her hand tightened. I wasn't expecting this to work. The marriage, the partnership, any of it. I thought we'd just be two people sharing a house. And now? He stood, pulling her up with him. Now I don't want to imagine this life without you in it. Clara's breath caught. They'd grown close over the months, shared a bed, built a business together. But they'd never said out loud what was happening between them. Never acknowledged that somewhere along the way, necessity had become something deeper. Caleb leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, giving her every chance to pull away. Clara didn't. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back. When they finally broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We'll look into buying the mine, he said quietly, together. The process of acquiring the mine took 3 months of negotiations, inspections, and paperwork. Caleb and Clara met with territorial officials, potential investors, and banking representatives. They walked every tunnel in the mine with an engineer who pointed out structural problems and estimated repair costs. The numbers were staggering. Even with investors, they'd need to take on significant debt, and there was no guarantee the mine would be profitable enough to pay it off. Clara lay awake some nights, terrified that she'd convinced Caleb to risk everything on a dream that might collapse around them. But every time the fear threatened to overwhelm her, she reminded herself why they were doing this. Not for profit or power, but to create something stable and good for people who deserved better than what they'd had. The deal finally closed in September. Clara and Caleb became the new owners of the Turner's Bend mine, along with 3 investors from the territorial capital who'd been impressed by their track record with the lumber operation. The workers, both from the lumber crew and new hires, gathered for the announcement. Caleb stood on the porch of the marshal's office and laid out the terms clearly. This mine is going to run different than before, he said. Fair wages, 8-hour shifts, safety inspections every week. Anyone who gets hurt on the job keeps their salary while they recover. And if you've got concerns about working conditions, you bring them to me or Clara and we'll address them. What if we don't like how things are run? Someone called out. We getting fired for complaining? No. You're getting heard. Caleb's voice was firm. I'm not Brennan. I don't profit when you suffer. We all succeed together, or we all fail together. There was skepticism in the crowd. These men had been burned before by promises from mine owners. But they showed up for work the next day, and the day after that, and slowly the skepticism began to shift into cautious trust. Clara took on the role of managing both businesses' administrative side. Peter, now walking with a cane but fully capable of handling paperwork, became her assistant. Together they tracked payroll, expenses, contracts, and safety reports. It was exhausting work. Clara often came home after dark, her hands cramped from writing and her head spinning with numbers. But she loved it. For the first time in her life, she was using her mind for something more than teaching multiplication tables. She was running businesses, making decisions that affected dozens of families, shaping the economic future of an entire town. Caleb noticed the change in her. One night he found her asleep at the kitchen table, her head pillowed on a ledger, ink staining her fingers. He gently woke her. "Come to bed, Clara." She blinked up at him, disoriented. "What time is it?" "Past midnight. You've been working for 16 hours. I need to finish the quarterly reports. They'll wait until morning." He helped her up, steadying her when she swayed with exhaustion. "You're no good to anyone if you work yourself into the ground." Clara wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She let him guide her to the bedroom, helped her out of her ink-stained dress, and tucked her into bed like a child. "I'm not usually this useless," she mumbled. Caleb smiled and brushed hair back from her face. "You're the least useless person I've ever met. Now sleep." She was unconscious within seconds. The next morning, Clara woke to find Caleb already gone and a note on the table. "Took care of the morning shift. Rest." See? It was a small thing, but it reminded Clara of why their partnership worked. They took care of each other. When one stumbled, the other was there to catch them. By late October, both the lumber operation and the mine were running smoothly. Crime in Turner's Bend was almost non-existent. The school had 23 students and a waiting list. Houses that had been falling apart were being repaired. The general store expanded, a second saloon opened, and then a proper restaurant. The town was thriving in a way it never had under Brennan's control. But success brought new challenges. With more people came more complexity. Disputes over property lines, arguments about water rights, a fight between two workers that escalated until Caleb had to lock both men up for a night to cool down. And then there was the pregnancy. Clara noticed first that her monthly cycle was late. Then came the nausea, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. She'd throw up behind the schoolhouse during recess, then compose herself and go back to teaching as if nothing had happened. She didn't tell Caleb right away. She wasn't sure how he'd react. They'd never discussed children. The marriage had started as a practical arrangement, and even though it had evolved into something real, they'd never planned for this. But her body made the decision for her. One morning, she was sick 3 times before breakfast, and Caleb finally confronted her. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. Clara wiped her mouth with a shaky hand. "A few weeks." "You're pregnant." It wasn't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. Caleb's face went completely blank. No emotion, no reaction, just a careful blankness that scared her more than anger would have. "Say something," she said quietly. "I need to check on the crew." He grabbed his coat and walked out. Clara stood in the kitchen, her hand on her stomach, and fought back tears. She'd known this might happen. They'd been sharing a bed for months, and they hadn't exactly been careful, but she hadn't expected him to just leave. He didn't come home until after dark. When he finally walked through the door, Clara was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. Caleb sat down across from her. His face was drawn, and there was something haunted in his eyes. "Elizabeth was pregnant when she got sick," he said without preamble. 4 months along. I lost them both in the same week." Clara's heart broke. "Caleb, I can't do that again." His voice was rough. "I can't watch you suffer and not be able to help. I can't bury another wife and child." "You won't have to. You don't know that. Women die in childbirth out here all the time. The nearest real doctor is 2 days away. If something goes wrong..." Clara reached across the table and grabbed his hand, forcing him to look at her. "I'm scared too. I won't lie and say I'm not. But we can't live our lives terrified of what might happen. We just have to do the best we can and hope it's enough." "What if it's not?" "Then we deal with it. Together." She squeezed his hand. "But right now, in this moment, I'm healthy. The baby's healthy. We have time to prepare, to make sure we have everything we need when the time comes." Caleb looked down at their joined hands. "I don't know if I can do this." "Yes, you can. Because you're the strongest person I know, and you've already survived worse than this." He was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, he stood and pulled Clara to her feet. He wrapped his arms around her and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "I can't lose you," he whispered against her hair. "You won't." But even as she said it, Clara felt her own fear coiling in her chest. Childbirth was dangerous everywhere, but especially out here on the frontier where medical care was scarce and complications often meant death. She pushed the fear down and focused on what she could control. She read every book on pregnancy and childbirth she could find. She talked to women in town who'd given birth successfully, learning what to expect and what supplies to gather. She made lists, prepared the house, and tried to ignore the way Caleb watched her with barely concealed terror every time she so much as stumbled. Winter came early that year. By November, snow was already piling up, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the basins overnight. Clara continued teaching as long as she could, but by December her belly was too large to ignore, and she had to stop. The forced rest drove her crazy. She was used to being busy, productive, useful. Sitting at home while Caleb worked felt wrong. "You're growing a human being," Caleb told her when she complained. "That's productive." "I feel useless." "You're not." He sat beside her on the bed, his hand resting on her swollen stomach. "You're doing the hardest work there is." The baby kicked, and Caleb's eyes widened. It was the first time he'd felt it move. Clara watched emotions flicker across his face. Wonder, fear, hope, all tangled together. "It's real," he said quietly. "It's been real for months." "I know, but feeling it move—" He stopped, struggling for words. "It makes it different." Clara took his hand and pressed it more firmly against her belly. "We're going to be all right, Caleb, all three of us." She said it with conviction, willing it to be true. The baby came on a frigid night in late January. Clara's water broke just after dinner, and within an hour the contractions started, slow at first, then building with relentless intensity. Caleb sent for Mrs. Patterson, who'd helped deliver half the babies in Turner's Bend, and then for the doctor in case complications arose. But with the storm raging outside and snow piling up fast, there was no guarantee anyone would make it in time. Clara labored through the night, gripping Caleb's hand so hard she left bruises. The pain was worse than anything she'd imagined, waves of agony that left her gasping and shaking. "I can't do this," she sobbed at one point. "Yes, you can." Caleb's voice was steady, even though his face was pale with fear. "You're the toughest person I know. You can do this." Mrs. Patterson arrived near dawn, took one look at Clara, and started barking orders. Caleb moved to leave. Men weren't supposed to be present for births, but Clara grabbed his hand. "Stay." "Clara, I don't think—" "Stay." She looked up at him through tears. "Please." He stayed. The baby came just as the sun was rising, sliding into the world with a cry that cut through the exhausted haze in Clara's mind. Mrs. Patterson worked quickly, cleaning the infant and checking for problems while Clara lay back against the pillows, too drained to move. "It's a boy," Mrs. Patterson announced. "Healthy lungs, good color, all his fingers and toes." She placed the baby in Clara's arms, and Clara looked down at her son, red-faced and squalling, perfect and terrifying, and started crying. Caleb stood beside the bed, staring at the baby like he couldn't quite believe it was real. His hand shook when he reached out to touch the tiny head. "He's so small," he whispered. "He's perfect." Clara looked up at him. "We did it." Caleb's eyes were wet. "You did it." He bent down and kissed her forehead, then very carefully kissed the baby's head. And in that moment, Clara saw the fear in his expression finally crack and give way to something else. Hope. They named him James, after Caleb's father. The first few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, constant feeding, and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. Clara was exhausted in ways she hadn't known were possible. Her body ached, her breasts were sore from nursing, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept for more than 2 hours at a stretch. But she'd never been happier. Caleb threw himself into fatherhood with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. He changed diapers, walked the floor with James when the baby wouldn't sleep, and handled the night feedings when Clara was too exhausted to function. "You're good at this," Clara told him one night. She was watching him rock James, the baby finally quiet after hours of crying. I have no idea what I'm doing. Neither do I, but we're figuring it out together. Caleb looked down at James, his expression soft in the lamplight. I thought I'd be terrified every moment, and I am, a little. But mostly, I'm just... He trailed off, searching for words. Grateful? Clara suggested. Yeah, grateful. He met her eyes. For you, for him, for this life we've built. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Hormones, exhaustion, or genuine emotion, she couldn't tell anymore. Me too. As winter slowly gave way to spring, they settled into a new rhythm. Clara took over managing the businesses from home, with Peter bringing her paperwork and reports. Caleb handled the day-to-day operations while making sure he was home every evening to help with James. The town rallied around them. Women brought food and offered to watch the baby so Clara could rest. The workers on both crews were understanding when Caleb needed to leave early or arrive late. Even Davis, who'd always been prickly and independent, stopped by one evening with a hand-carved cradle. Made it myself, he said gruffly, setting it down in the bedroom. Figured you could use it. Clara was so touched she hugged him, which made the tough logger turn bright red and mumble something about needing to leave. Life wasn't perfect. James got sick in March. A fever that spiked so high Clara thought her heart would stop. But he recovered. Money was tight some months when expenses ran high, and there were still occasional conflicts in town that required Caleb's attention as marshal, but the foundation they'd built held strong. One evening in May, Clara was nursing James on the porch, while Caleb sat beside her, whittling a toy from a piece of scrap wood. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air smelled like pine and fresh earth. You ever think about where we'd be if you hadn't gotten on that stagecoach? Caleb asked. Clara considered the question. Probably married to my stepfather's business partner. Miserable. Maybe dead by now. Don't say that. It's true. He wasn't a kind man. She looked down at James, who'd fallen asleep at her breast. This life, you, the town, our son, it's everything I never knew I wanted. Caleb set down his whittling and took her free hand. I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You brought me back to life. We brought each other back, Clara corrected. He kissed her knuckles. Yeah, we did. They sat together as darkness fell, watching their son sleep and listening to the sounds of Turner's Bend settling in for the night. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing a fiddle. A dog barked. Voices drifted on the breeze. It was ordinary and mundane and absolutely precious. Clara had come to Montana Territory expecting nothing more than survival. Instead, she'd found purpose, partnership, and a kind of love she hadn't known existed. The steady, tested kind built on shared hardship and mutual respect. The journey had been brutal, but sitting here on this porch, holding her sleeping son while the man she'd married out of desperation held her hand, Clara understood that every hard mile had been worth it. This was home, and she would fight to protect it for as long as she had breath in her body. The years that followed James's birth brought changes Clara couldn't have predicted. Some good, some hard, all of them shaping the life they were building in ways both visible and invisible. James grew into a sturdy toddler with Caleb's gray eyes and Clara's stubborn streak. He learned to walk by pulling himself up on furniture in the marshal's office, tottering between his parents while workers from both the lumber operation and the mine stopped by to check on the boss's son. The rough men who cut timber and hauled copper ore showed a surprising gentleness with the child, carving him toys and teaching him to count using chunks of wood. Clara returned to teaching when James was 6 months old, bringing him to the schoolhouse in a basket and letting the older girls take turns watching him while she worked. It wasn't ideal, but it functioned. The school had grown to 32 students now, requiring Clara to hire an assistant teacher, a young woman named Margaret who'd come west with her family and had actual training from a normal school back in Ohio. "You're building something real here," Margaret told Clara one afternoon. They were cleaning up after the students had left, and James was napping in his basket. "These children are getting an education that'll actually serve them. That's rare out here." Clara wiped down the chalkboard. "It's not enough, though. We need books. Real textbooks, not the scraps we're working with. And we need supplies. Proper slates, chalk that doesn't crumble, maybe even a globe so they can see where they are in the world. That costs money." "Everything costs money." Clara set down the rag and looked around the schoolhouse. But money's something we have more of now than we did. It was true. The lumber operation and mine were both profitable. Not wildly so. Caleb and Clara kept wages high and reinvested most profits back into safety improvements and equipment, but stable. They'd paid off half their debt to the investors. The house had been expanded with 2 additional rooms. They had savings. Clara started planning a fundraiser for the school, but before she could organize it, something else demanded her attention. Caleb came home one evening in June with news that made her stomach drop. "Brennan's back." Clara looked up from where she was mashing potatoes for dinner. James was on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. "What do you mean he's back?" "I mean, he rode into town this afternoon, checked into the boarding house, and has been having meetings with some of the old mine workers." Caleb's voice was tight. "Davis heard he's offering double wages to anyone who quits working for us and joins him in a new venture." "What kind of venture?" "Don't know yet, but he's got money again. New clothes, new horse, acting like he owns the place." Caleb sat down heavily. "I thought we were done with him." Clara finished mashing the potatoes with more force than necessary. "We ran him out once. We can do it again." "Not the same way. He's smarter now. Whatever he's planning, he's learned from his mistakes." Over the next week, Brennan's plan became clear. He'd partnered with investors from back east and bought land just outside Turner's Bend's boundaries, technically outside Caleb's jurisdiction as marshal. He was planning to open a new mine, smaller than the old operation, but with enough capacity to compete directly with Caleb and Clara's business. "He's going after our workers," Clara said, studying the reports Peter had compiled. "He's offering wages we can't match without going into debt again." "So we don't match them," Caleb said. "We hold steady and trust that the men know what they're getting with us versus what they'd get with Brennan. And if they don't, then we adapt." But adaptation was harder than it sounded. Within 2 weeks, 5 workers had quit to join Brennan's operation. Then 8, then 12. Each departure stung because Clara and Caleb had invested in these men, trained them, paid them fairly, treated them with respect. And they were leaving for a few extra dollars a week. "I can't really blame them," Davis said when Clara confronted him about it. He was one of the few who'd stayed despite Brennan's offers. "Most of these men live week to week. Extra money means their kids eat better, means maybe they save enough to buy land someday. You and the marshal treat people right, but right don't always pay the bills." Clara wanted to argue, but she understood. She'd been desperate once too. She knew what it was like to make impossible choices for survival. The real blow came when Peter walked into her office one morning looking sick with guilt. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. Clara set down her pen. "You're leaving." "Brennan offered me a job as his head bookkeeper, twice what you're paying me." Peter wouldn't meet her eyes. "Sarah's pregnant again. We need the money." Clara's first instinct was anger. After everything they'd done for Peter, after giving him work when his leg was ruined, but she forced it down. Peter had a family to support. That wasn't betrayal. That was responsibility. "When do you start?" she asked quietly. 2 weeks. I wanted to give you time to find a replacement." He finally looked up. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Turner. I know you and the marshal gave me a chance when no one else would, but I have to think about my wife and babies." "I know." Clara stood and extended her hand. "Thank you for your honesty and for the work you've done here. I hope it goes well for you." Peter shook her hand, looking relieved that she wasn't making this harder. After he left, Clara sat alone in the office and let herself feel the frustration and hurt before pushing it aside. There was too much work to do to wallow. That evening, she and Caleb sat on the porch after James was asleep, talking through their options. "We're losing the labor war," Clara said bluntly. "Brennan can outbid us because he's got fresh capital and no ethics. He'll pay high wages now, then cut them once he's dominant again. But by the time workers figure that out, we'll be out of business. So what do we do?" Clara had been thinking about this all day. "We stop competing on wages and start competing on something Brennan can't match." "Like what?" "Ownership." She turned to face him. "What if we gave workers a stake in the businesses? Not charity, real ownership. They work for us. They get shares. They help the company succeed. They profit directly." Caleb was quiet, thinking it through. "That's never been done before. Not out here." "Exactly. Which means Brennan won't see it coming." Clara leaned forward. "Think about it. Workers who own part of the business have incentive to make it succeed. They'll work harder, stay loyal, and we build something stable that can't be undercut by the next person who shows up with money. The investors won't like it. Sharing ownership means sharing profits. Then we buy them out. Use our savings, take a loan if we have to. We make this business fully ours, then we share it with the people who actually do the work. It was radical, dangerous even. If it failed, they'd lose everything. But Caleb looked at her with that expression she'd come to recognize, the one that said he trusted her judgment even when it scared him. "All right," he said, "let's do it." The process took 3 months of brutal negotiation. The investors wanted a premium to sell their shares. The bank wanted assurances that the new ownership structure wouldn't collapse. And the workers themselves were skeptical. They'd heard promises before. Clara handled most of the organizing while Caleb kept the operations running. She drew up contracts, calculated share distributions, and met with every single worker individually to explain how it would work. "You work for us for 5 years, you get a 1% share of profits," she explained to a logger named Tom. 10 years, 2%, 15 years, 3%. It's not immediate wealth, but over time, you build real ownership. "What's to stop you and the marshal from just keeping all the profits anyway?" Tom asked suspiciously. "These contracts." Clara pushed the papers across the table. "Legally binding, enforced by the territorial court. If we violate them, you can sue us and take everything we own." Tom read through the contract slowly. He wasn't a fast reader, but he was thorough. Finally, he looked up. "This is real?" "It's real." He signed. One by one, workers came around. Some signed immediately. Others waited to see if it was genuine. A few left for Brennan's operation anyway, preferring guaranteed higher wages now over potential profits later. But most stayed, and when word spread about what Caleb and Clara were offering, workers from Brennan's new mine started showing up, asking if the offer applied to them too. "You left us for higher pay," Clara told one former employee who'd come back. "Why should we trust you won't leave again?" The man, a copper miner named Jack, looked her straight in the eye. "Because Brennan's already cutting corners. 3 men got hurt last week in a tunnel collapse that shouldn't have happened. He's paying more, but the work's killing us. I'd rather earn less and know I'm not going to die in a hole in the ground." Clara hired him back. Brennan's response was swift and vicious. He started spreading rumors that the ownership shares were worthless, that Caleb and Clara were running a scheme to keep workers loyal while actually paying them less. He took out advertisements in the territorial newspaper claiming Turner's Bend operations were unsafe and poorly managed. Clara wanted to respond in kind, but Caleb stopped her. "Let him talk," he said. "We respond by doing the work, by proving him wrong every single day." It was hard advice to follow. Clara hated watching Brennan lie about them while they stayed silent. But Caleb was right. Their reputation had to be built on actions, not words. The turning point came in October, when Brennan's mine had its first major accident. A tunnel collapsed, trapping 6 men underground for 14 hours. 3 died before they could be dug out. Caleb, in his capacity as territorial marshal, was required to investigate. He spent 2 days examining the site, interviewing survivors, and documenting safety violations. His official report was damning. Brennan had ignored basic safety protocols, used substandard support timbers, and pushed workers into dangerous conditions to maximize production. The territorial government levied massive fines, families of the dead men sued, and workers abandoned Brennan's operation in droves. Clara felt no satisfaction in it. 3 men were dead. Their families were devastated. The fact that it proved Caleb and Clara's approach was right didn't make up for the loss. She attended all 3 funerals. So did Caleb. They didn't make speeches or use the tragedy to score points. They just stood with the grieving families and offered what comfort they could. Afterward, one of the widows approached Clara. "My husband left your mine to work for Brennan," she said. Her name was Ruth, and she had 2 young children clinging to her skirts. "He thought he was doing the right thing, thought the extra money would help us." Clara took her hand. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Mr. Brennan's given us nothing. Says the accident was my husband's fault for being careless." Ruth's voice shook. "I don't know how we're going to survive." Clara made a decision on the spot. "Come see me tomorrow. We'll find you work. And your children, they'll have spots in the school, no tuition." "Why would you help me? My husband left you." "Because you need help. That's reason enough." Ruth broke down crying, and Clara held her while her children watched with wide, frightened eyes. That night, Caleb found Clara sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at nothing. "You all right?" he asked. "3 men died because Brennan values money over lives. And I'm supposed to feel vindicated because it proves we were right?" Clara's voice was hollow. "I don't feel vindicated. I feel sick." Caleb sat beside her. "I know, but we can't save everyone, Clara. We can only do our best and hope it's enough." "What if our best isn't good enough?" "Then we keep trying anyway." He took her hand. "That's all anyone can do." Clara wanted to believe him, but that night she lay awake thinking about all the ways things could go wrong, all the people depending on them, all the lives that could be destroyed if they made the wrong choice. The weight of it was crushing. But the next morning, she got up, fed James, and went to work. Because that's what you did. You carried the weight, and you kept moving. Brennan left town a month later, his reputation destroyed and his new mine defunct. This time, Clara didn't think he'd be back. He'd lost too much, burned too many bridges. There was nothing left for him in Turner's Bend. With the competition gone, Caleb and Clara's businesses stabilized. The ownership sharing program proved successful. Workers stayed longer, worked harder, and took pride in the operations because they genuinely benefited from success. Profits were lower than they might have been under traditional ownership, but stability was worth more than maximum returns. The school continued growing. Clara eventually had to hire 2 more teachers and expand the building. Children who'd started with her barely able to read were now studying literature and advanced mathematics. Some were talking about going to university back east. James grew into a bright, curious child who spent his days alternating between the schoolhouse and following his father around town. He learned to read at 4, could handle basic arithmetic by 5, and had strong opinions about everything by 6. "He's got your stubbornness," Caleb told Clara one evening. "And your inability to back down from an argument," she countered. They were sitting on the porch again. It had become their evening ritual, a quiet hour after James was in bed where they could just be together. Caleb whittled while Clara mended clothes or read. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. "You ever think about having another child?" Caleb asked. Clara looked up from her mending. They'd discussed it before, but never seriously. "Do you want another?" "I think James would like a sibling, and—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "I was terrified when you were pregnant with him. Thought I'd lose you like I lost Elizabeth. But we got through it, and I think I could handle it again without falling apart." "You didn't fall apart the first time." "I came close." He set down his whittling. "But I'd like to try again, if you're willing." Clara thought about the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the sheer overwhelming responsibility of raising a child. Then she thought about James's laugh, his curiosity, the way he looked at the world like everything was possible. "I'm willing," she said. Their daughter Sarah was born 2 years later, in the spring when the mountains were green and the creek was running high with snow melt. The birth was easier than James's had been, faster, less frightening, though still painful enough that Clara swore halfway through she'd never do this again. But when they placed Sarah in her arms, red-faced and squalling just like her brother had been, Clara fell completely in love. Caleb cried when he held her, actual tears running down his face while he stared at his daughter like she was made of something precious and breakable. "We have a family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Clara, exhausted and sore but happier than she could remember being, smiled up at him. "We do." James was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to hold her and touch her constantly. They had to teach him to be gentle, that babies were fragile, but he took to being a big brother with enthusiasm. Life settled into a new rhythm. Clara juggled teaching, managing the business paperwork, and raising 2 children. Caleb balanced his marshal duties with running the lumber and mining operations and being present for his family. It was exhausting and chaotic and sometimes felt impossible. But it worked. The town around them continued evolving. Turner's Bend wasn't a rough mining camp anymore. It was becoming a real community with a church, a proper doctor's office, a lending library Clara had organized, and plans for a town hall. People were building permanent homes instead of temporary shelters. Families were putting down roots, and Clara and Caleb were at the center of it all, not as rulers or bosses, but as partners in a larger effort to create something worth preserving. Davis, who'd been with them from the beginning, eventually became foreman of the lumber operation. He married Mrs. Patterson's daughter and built a house near the creek. Peter, despite his stint with Brennan, came back and resumed managing the books. Ruth, the widow Clara had helped, became the school's administrator. The people Clara had helped, and who had helped her, became the foundation of something larger than any individual success. But life wasn't all progress and achievement. There were setbacks. A fire destroyed part of the lumber mill in 1878, setting them back 6 months. The mine hit a dry patch where copper deposits thinned out, and they had to dig deeper and more expensively to maintain production. Caleb was injured breaking up a fight and spent 2 weeks recovering from broken ribs. And then there was the winter of 1880, when James, at age 7, got sick with pneumonia. Clara had never been so frightened in her life. She sat by his bedside for 5 days straight while he burned with fever, his breathing shallow and labored. The doctor came twice a day, but there was little he could do except recommend cool compresses and wait. Caleb practically lived at the church, not quite praying but sitting in the quiet and trying to find some peace. Clara alternated between caring for James and trying to keep Sarah, who was only 3, entertained and away from her sick brother. On the 5th night, James's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes, looked at Clara, and said in a hoarse little voice, "I'm hungry." Clara burst into tears and hugged him until he complained that she was squeezing too tight. When Caleb got home and heard the news, he went into the bedroom, scooped James up despite the doctor's orders for rest, and held him like he'd never let go. "Don't scare me like that again," he said roughly. "I didn't mean to get sick, Papa." "I know, but you're not allowed to anyway." James, still weak but clearly on the mend, just nodded seriously. That night, after both children were asleep, Claire and Caleb sat together in the darkness. "I thought we were going to lose him," Caleb said. "So did I. I don't know how people survive losing children. I really don't." His voice cracked. "If something had happened, but it didn't." Clara gripped his hand. "He's all right. We're all right." They sat in silence for a long time. Then Caleb said, "I used to think surviving was enough. After Elizabeth died, I just wanted to get through each day without falling apart. That was my entire goal, just survive. And now I know survival isn't the point. Living is. Actually building something, caring about people, risking getting hurt because the alternative is worse." He looked at her. "You taught me that." "I think we taught each other." He pulled her close, and they stayed like that until dawn. 2 people who'd started as strangers, become partners, and somehow built a life that mattered. The years continued passing. James recovered fully and grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and wanted to be a teacher like his mother. Sarah was wild and fearless, always climbing things and asking questions that didn't have easy answers. The businesses matured. They'd never be wealthy. Too much of the profit went back to workers and community improvements. But they were stable and sustainable. The ownership-sharing model Clara had pioneered was being copied by other operations across the territory. Clara's school became known regionally for its quality. Students came from neighboring towns to attend. Several of her former students went on to universities and professional careers that would have been impossible without the education she'd given them. Caleb eventually stepped back from active marshal duties, training a younger man to take over while he focused on the businesses and local governance. He was elected mayor 3 times, though he claimed each time that he didn't want the job and was only doing it because no one else would. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Claire and Caleb took a rare evening away from responsibilities. They left the children with Mrs. Patterson and rode out to the place where they'd first met, the spot where Caleb had found Clara half frozen in the snow. It looked different now. The town had expanded, and what had once been empty frontier was now dotted with homes and cultivated fields. But Clara could still picture that night, the terror and desperation, the stranger's hand reaching down to save her. "I was so scared," she said, standing at the spot where she'd collapsed. "I thought I was going to die." "I was scared too," Caleb admitted. "When I saw you in the snow, I thought I was too late. Then you opened your eyes and looked at me like you were ready to fight anyone who tried to stop you." "I was ready to fight. I'd come too far to give up." Caleb pulled her close. "I'm glad you didn't. Glad you got on that stagecoach. Glad you answered that advertisement. Glad you said yes, even though I was a stranger, and this was insane." Clara leaned against him. "It was insane, still is sometimes, but it's ours." They stood there as the sun set, 2 people who'd gambled everything on a desperate arrangement and somehow won. The final years of Clara's story aren't marked by dramatic events, but by the steady accumulation of small moments that make up a life. James graduated from university and came back to Turner's Bend to teach at his mother's school. Sarah married a young engineer and moved to Denver, where she became involved in labor reform movements. The businesses continued operating successfully. When Caleb and Clara eventually retired from active management, the ownership structure they'd built meant the transitions were smooth. Workers who'd been with them for decades became the new leadership. Clara kept teaching until she was 65, finally stepping down when her eyes got too weak to read small print. She spent her later years writing textbooks for frontier schools and advocating for education reform at the territorial level. Caleb lived to see Turner's Bend incorporate as an official town, with real laws and infrastructure and all the things he'd worked toward for decades. He died at 73, peacefully in his sleep, with Clara beside him. Clara lived another 8 years without him. She watched grandchildren grow up and great-grandchildren be born. She saw Turner's Bend become prosperous and stable in ways that would have seemed impossible when she'd first arrived half-frozen in a blizzard. And when she finally died, at 81, surrounded by family, in the house she and Caleb had built together, her last thoughts were of that desperate girl who'd climbed on a stagecoach with nothing but a battered trunk and a wild hope that somewhere out there was a life worth living. She'd found it, not because it was easy or because she'd been lucky, but because she'd been willing to fight for it. Because she'd partnered with someone who respected her enough to fight alongside her. Because they'd built something larger than themselves and shared it with others. The funeral was attended by hundreds, former students, workers who'd shared in the business's profits, families who'd been helped over the years, people whose lives had been touched by what Clara and Caleb Turner had built in Turner's Bend. They laid her to rest beside Caleb under a simple stone that read, Clara Turner, teacher, builder, partner. James, now a gray-haired man himself, stood at the grave and thought about his mother's journey, the desperation that had brought her west, the stranger she'd married, the empire they'd built not on exploitation but on shared purpose. She changed everything, he said to his own children, who stood beside him. Came here with nothing and created something that outlasted her. That's still here, still working, still helping people. His daughter, Clara's granddaughter, named after her, asked, what was the most important thing she ever did? James considered the question. He could have said building the businesses, or reforming education, or pioneering worker ownership. All of those were true. But what he said was, she showed people that you don't have to accept the world as it is, that if you're willing to work hard enough and trust the right people, you can build something better. It was the lesson Clara had lived by, the principle that had guided every decision she made. And in Turner's Bend, in the schools and businesses and community structures that still operated on the foundations she'd laid, that lesson continued shaping lives long after she was gone. Because that's what legacy really means. Not monuments or wealth or fame, but the ripples you leave behind, the lives you touch, the systems you build that help others build their own futures. Clara Turner had arrived in Montana Territory as a desperate woman fleeing a life that would have destroyed her. She'd married a stranger, survived a brutal frontier, fought against exploitation and greed, and built an empire on principles of fairness and shared prosperity. And in doing so, she'd proven that the most radical thing you can do isn't survive. It's thrive in a way that makes it possible for others to thrive too. Years after Clara's death, a young woman arrived in Turner's Bend on a stagecoach, carrying everything she owned and looking for a fresh start. She'd heard about the town where workers owned shares of businesses, where the school was free and excellent, where a woman could build a life on her own terms. She'd heard about Clara Turner, and standing in the town square, looking at the buildings and the people, and the life that had been built here, she thought, if Clara could do it, maybe I can too. That was the real legacy. Not just what Clara had built, but what she'd made possible for everyone who came after. The storm that had nearly killed her had instead brought her to exactly where she needed to be. And the life she'd built from that desperate beginning had become a light for others to follow. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.